Well, good morning, good afternoon. Hope everybody's doing okay. This is going to be for Thursday, January the 21st in Religion 325. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about African religion and the slaves. We want to talk about the history of religion in America, and we cannot forget all the things that the slaves brought, as well as the rich religious heritage of the African Americans that even exist today. And it's a subject that gets overlooked. You know, we think of the Spanish and the English, and oftentimes they're praised for the idea that they're going to bring Christianity to the New World. But we forget that there was religion here before we got, before the Europeans got here, one. And we also forget the people who hadn't even planned on being here in the first place, African slaves. And the first Africans were indentured servants, and they arrived as early as 1619. And indentured servants were people who agreed to work for somebody for a while in order to get, fare over and safety. But lots of times, these people's stay were extended, whether they wanted to or not. And as I said, the demise of Native Americans due to European diseases and the advent of field crops such as sugar, rice, and cotton created like that storm for that need, that demand for a lot of people. And you just didn't have that many Europeans, and you didn't have that many Europeans who were willing to do it. And so the African slave trade came to America. We know a little bit about these people, not as much as we would like, but we do know that some of the religion of the slaves dealt with. Let's see if I can, once again, attempt to share my screen. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen now, sorry. And here we go. So one thing about the religion of the slaves that we will talk about is they had a thing called conjure, which is a combination of the African indigenous religions, often mixed with some Christianity. And so a lot of times you will even see this even today in the nation of Haiti with Roman Catholicism and a little bit of voodoo, hoodoo, and they are two separate things, believe it or not. Hoodoo is the practice of spirituality carried to the United States by West Africans as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. It's a blend of practices from the people of the Congo, Nigeria, and others, and it did a lot of things as far as spells and natural ideas about things. It's a magical tradition. There's spiritual power invoked for various purposes. You could kind of cast spells on people for healing, protection, self-defense. And so the African slaves had a little bit of their own native religion that they would bring, but they also would mix that a little bit with Christianity as they would learn some from their captors. And they would also, surprisingly, bring the Nation of Islam religion. Well, not the Nation of Islam, but the religion of Islam here. In 2015, Barack Obama addressed a summit on violence and extremism in religion and said, "Here in America, Islam has been woven into the fabric of our country since its founding. Generation of Muslim immigrants came here and went to work as farmers and merchants and factory workers, helped to lay railroads and build up America." And a lot of people got offended at this. They were like, wait a minute, George Washington, Ben Franklin, Muslims? How is that? But we forget the African slaves, and we forget the part they played in building America and adding to the richness of our religion. And we'll see this later in my lecture a little bit when we discuss their influence upon American religious music. And some historians estimate that up to 20% of the 400,000 slaves who made it to North America were Muslims. So think about that. 20% of 400,000 slaves may have been Muslims. And also, Barack Obama once made a comment that Islam has always been a part of America. Indeed, a number of the founding fathers did explicitly mention Muslims, along with other believers outside the prevailing Protestant mainstream. They called them Mahometans, and Thomas Jefferson explained in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he wrote, it was designed to protect all faiths. And I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson now. He said, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and the Mohammedan. And so our founding fathers did think about Islam, at least as a part of having a freedom to worship. They didn't want to deny freedom to really anybody. Sometimes Muslims were also alluded to as Turks during this time. Mosques have been in America since the colonial era, believe it or not. Between 1731 and 1733, an African-American Muslim slave and Islamic scholar, Joe bin Solomon, he was a cattle driver. He would regularly steal away to the woods there for his prayers, in spite of a white boy who threw dirt on him as he made his prostrations. And so this is something that we know about as true. Another aspect of the religion of the slaves was Christianity, of course. One justification was the Africans would have had no exposure to Christianity had they not been enslaved. You know, it's kind of a tough justification for enslaving somebody, is to say, well, you know, I know we treated them badly and we did all this stuff, but hey, they learned about Jesus. You know, I don't know that the idea of love your neighbor as yourself comes out very strongly in slavery. But if Christianizing was the primary concern of these people, why did they not do this before? Why did they only wait until the slaves were here? Also, African Christianity had existed for centuries before the Europeans came. Islam was just a little more successful on the Western side. One of the more well-known Christian fathers from the 4th century, maybe you've heard of St. Augustine of Hippo. He was the guy who came up with the idea of original sin. Well, he was from Algeria and most certainly was either African or Black. And if the issue was conversion, why subject them to the most inhumane treatment in the world when sometimes up to 40% of them died on the voyage to America? So despite the fact that a lot of people right before the American Civil War wanted to justify slavery as a benign institution that actually did good for the slaves and taught them right religion, you know, there's just not a lot of justification for it. Here's a diagram of what a slave ship would have looked like coming to America. And as you can imagine, these folks were tied down. They weren't allowed to eat much. They probably didn't have much of a place to go to the bathroom. It's a very horrible, horrible environment. So this doesn't really seem like to me that they would have been, the primary focus would have been trying to Christianize these people. There were some, though, in the slave process who went to great lengths to to make their slaves Christian. Maybe it was to ease a guilty conscience. I'm not sure. But this idea, though, of Christianity, which promises a reward in the next life, which promises peace in the next life, it was very appealing to people who had absolutely no peace in this life. So many of the slaves readily accepted the religion of Christianity. And as I said, there were some folks who said that slavery was justified by Christianity. It's the way it's always been. It was in the Bible. So if we talk about slaves in the Bible, well, my gosh, if God let it happen then, it must be okay now. And there was also kind of a belief in a divine providence of God, that God allowed everything to happen, and everything that happened was his will, otherwise it wouldn't happen. Therefore, since slavery is here, it must be God's will. And since it's God's will, we really don't need to mess with it. And so once again, that's a justification for it. But there are themes in the Bible which suggested that all were free. The old was made new. And so it still had an appeal to the slaves, despite the fact that outwardly the Southern preachers used it to justify slavery. One of the big justifications comes from the book of Colossians in chapter 3:22, when it says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and curry to their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Well, the word for slave during the Roman Empire time was a little different than the word now. And slavery in the American experience was different because it was the only time really that slavery was based upon race and the thought of racial inferiority. In Roman times, when the New Testament was written, slavery was sometimes a condition of war, sometimes it was a condition of debt. It didn't matter what color you were, what religion you believed, anybody could be a slave, and some slaves had rights. Slavery in the New World was markedly different, more cruel, intolerant, and the person had absolutely no right. And it was based on the idea that these people were less than human. And so it's not the greatest thing in the world. There were some musical influences that would come about due to the slaves. It's called the callback method of singing. Basically, it helped to pass the time. It would synchronize some work task. And so they decided to do this. And I'm going to try to play a little bit of a video here for you of one of the callback methods of singing. And it doesn't seem to want to work. So let me try one more thing here. Let me try. I don't know why I can't get it to work. But I can't get it to work, so I apologize for that. So let me try to open this one more time because I really think this is a helpful thing. But it was called, as I said, the callback method of singing. Here we go. Let's see if this will work. You can see there how this is a callback method. The leader starts out, the crowd joins in. And I think you can also see there how this would have been an influence upon later musical styles, such as jazz, the blues, gospel. I think you can sense a lot of that in there. And it's a very musical. And in fact, a lot of the masters enjoyed listening to the people sing, strangely enough. And but it was a cry out to God. And so it was a cry out to God to help them, deliver them. And think about the whole idea of the Israelites being in Egypt under the influence of the Egyptians. They felt like they were in slavery and they called out for a deliverer. So this whole musical genre of calling out for a deliverer really appealed to these folks. Really, the idea of Moses appealed to them. Their worship, as I said, they had the callback style. It would eventually have the impact on musical styles such as the blues, jazz, hip hop, rap. But one thing you got to understand about it is it was a way of protest. And even to this day, usually in the African American community, you will see music sometimes used as a way to express discontent and protest. It's ingrained in the history that this was the one way they could do it that the master would not be upset with, because most of the time the master didn't even know they were protesting. Sometimes they thought they were they're just worshiping God, or they're just singing to help themselves or something like that. But this is probably a great comfort to these folks trying to understand. And I think in some ways it may explain why rap music may be more so violent and so more real to life. The history of African Americans has been to express themselves through song or music or poetry. And this basically influenced, as I said, jazz and the blues, as well as later on things such as a gospel tradition. Here's another song from the slave songbook, and it's called The Slave's Dream. Let's see if I can get that up there. Make it a little bigger. Said, I had a dream, a happy dream. I dreamed that I was free, and in my own bright land there was a home for me. Savannah's tide rushed bravely on. I saw wave roll over wave. And when in full delight I awoke, I found myself a slave. And when full delight I awoke, I found myself a slave. So there's still a little bit of a lament there. Perhaps one of the greatest, I think, musicals, slave songs is called Wade in the Water. And let me see if I can find that here. And the interesting thing about this song, Wade in the Water, is it has its kind of scriptural birth in the idea of Exodus 14, in the idea of passing through the Red Sea, you would find salvation, but also in John 5:4, when it talks about this certain pool that the angel of the Lord would come down and disturb, and if the guy could get into it quick enough, he could be healed. And so let's wade into the water. Let's find our salvation in the water. Let's do that. And so a lot of this dealt with the idea of trying to bring comfort, trying to bring normalcy, expression to their lives. So the things that are very important to understand about, and this is very brief, once again, I wish I could say a little bit more if we were in class together, and Lord willing, we will be on Tuesday of next week. So make sure you review all these videos. But the thing to know is that Islam was indeed here. It came with the slaves, as well as kind of some of the African religions that came with the slave. Some of the slaves mixed a lot of it together. Some of the slaves were more than happy to accept the idea of Christianity, because Christianity, when you think about it, of many religions, Christianity promises a hope for the future. You may be downtrodden now, but look up, child, because the future is coming. You will have a great reward. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. It's a very appealing message, and especially to people who are in oppression, and the Bible talks a lot about sin oppressing people and how we need freedom from sin. Well, that applies greatly to this idea of being in real oppression and getting real deliverance. The idea of Moses, as I said, was a big thing, that Moses would go down into Egypt and save the Jews from slavery and lead them into the promised land. And one thing to notice too about the African-American community is that during this time, the really only organization they could have would be religious. So a lot of their original leaders came up through churches. A lot of their original leaders came up as ministers. And that's why in the African-American community, you'll often see that it's not as suspect to see someone with the title Reverend doing a political cause. They have, in their history, they couldn't separate religion from political because their religion promised freedom. Well, then the idea is to work for it. You know, if Jesus says we're supposed to feed the poor, maybe we should feed the poor. If we're supposed to free the oppressed, let's free the oppressed. And so this was carried into the civil rights movement in the 1960s, very easy with people like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's very interesting to look at that history. But one thing that I wanted to touch on at least briefly in this class is the importance, the significance, the wonderful richness that African Americans have brought to the religious landscape of America. We can't forget that. We can't ignore it. And we have got to acknowledge its contribution. And like I said, if all we did was talk about the contribution to music alone, how would our lives be forever changed if we had not known the music of blues, the music of hip hop, the music of soul, the music of Motown? I mean, a lot of that came up with that idea of the protest, the poetry of this group of people in a beautiful, articulate, expressive way. And so I think that needs to be celebrated. If you watch the recent inauguration of Joe Biden, the young poet, and forgive me, I've forgotten her name because I'm an old man, but the young poet who stood there and read that poem, take a chance and listen to that and listen to how expressive and the hope that it brings. It's beautiful, and whatever political side you're on. So anyway, I hope to see you on Tuesday. If you have any questions, please email me, and I will talk to you later.